Hello, this is Dr. J. McCluskey, and it's my privilege to be sharing with you in a Introduction to the Bible study. I hope that you have a notebook that has all the outlines of the 8 studies that we will be sharing together. It is downloadable on a PDF file from our church website. You can get a binder and a notebook, compliments of our church for free in our church office. Just come by and we'll hand you out one during our office hours. It will help you a lot as we go through our studies together in our introduction to the Bible. And it's a lot of material to try to cover. So let me begin by giving this kind of an image. Have you ever been to one of those corn maze events that happen in the fall? So you're trying to find yourself from the entrance to the exit, and there's all kinds of twists and turns and places to go to, and you're not sure what direction is the right way. It may be a dead end, it may not. And at those places, there usually is a tower that somebody can get in and get the look of the whole maze, and they can give you some kindness and can direct you in some things to help you find your way out. And so we're kind of like in that tower here. We're not in too much of the details of the verses and the chapters of the Bible. We're going to have an elevated view to kind of have a grander scheme about things and a better understanding about it. It is a macro kind of look at the Bible as opposed to a micro where you might just study one word or one verse. But this will help us keep, when we do study in that way, things in a much better context. We may not have that grand scheme and appreciation to how the Bible is laid out. I remember when I was a little boy, we had January Bible study. And for a week in January, we were at church every night. And the children's study that year was 1st and 2nd Samuel. And part of that story is Solomon building the temple. And as a project one evening, again with elementary school kids, I drew a picture in my mind's head of what the temple would look like. And at every peak on the roof line of my temple, I put what I had seen on religious buildings all my life in the deep South. I put a cross. And the teacher graciously explained to me that, well, Solomon's time was in the Old Testament before Jesus died on the cross, so there probably wouldn't have been a cross on the temple. And it was just my lack of understanding of the grand landscape of the Bible. And years later into young adulthood, I might have been confused about whether David or Daniel came first in the chronology of the scriptures. So this is going to help you to kind of have that better context as you dig deeper then into Bible passages and Bible books and Bible studies itself. We'll spend 4 weeks, hopefully, on the Old Testament, 4 weeks, hopefully, on the New Testament as we share together. Now, on your outline, you'll see a note at the very top. And this is where I tip my hat and I pay tribute to Dr. David Platt, the past president of the International Mission Board, who prepared a lot of the structure of what I'm going to share with you as a study for his church. And he did it exceptionally well, and so it gives us a bit of a path to run on as we share together. So thank you, Dr. Platt, for your good work. So I'm going to answer some questions here at the beginning on why to study the Bible. Of all the limited times that we seem to have, why would we devote some of it to studying the Bible? And many people don't, and they don't because of what I call some myths, some common myths about the significance and relevance of the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament. And you know that TV show Mythbusters? Well, we're going to try to bust some of these myths after we describe them. The first is, folks will say the Old Testament is insignificant. You know, the real heart of our Christian faith is the New Testament. It's the coming of Jesus and his dying on the cross for us in grace and redemption. And the Old Testament is just the prelude to that, and it's not worth a lot of our attention. But in a sporting event, is the first half more important than the second half? I know the second half of an event can have some more drama and pressure as the clock's winding down and stuff, and it gets crunch time. But the first part is significant. So just saying, you be careful about saying it's insignificant. Some would say the Old Testament is irrelevant, like it doesn't relate to our lives anymore. You know, there's a lot of laws and rules about the food that you eat, about the sacrificial system, just things that in our modern day religious activities are not practiced anymore. And so, it's irrelevant because it's not something that is as directly applied to us. Excuse me. They also say the Old Testament is inconsistent. It seems there's a different thing going on to some in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some have concluded, wrongly I would say, the Old Testament God seems like an angry God, and the New Testament God, through Jesus, seems gracious and forgiving, compassionate, and loving. And they have trouble reconciling this, though I would say there's plenty of great quality, warm, compassionate, gracious qualities that we see in the Old Testament God. We also, of course, see the righteousness of God in the Old Testament and in the New Testament too. Others would say, last myth, that the Old Testament is incomprehensible. It's cumbersome. It's confusing. At some points, you might even say it's downright boring. Have you wandered through Leviticus? It can be a challenge, can't it? There are chapters full of just names, genealogies, just name after name after name, and they're hard to pronounce. And comprehending things, it's long, it's tedious. And when you get to the New Testament, you get to the Gospels, you get to the stories about Jesus and Jesus himself telling simple stories that are easy to understand in parables, and it's just a little easier to grasp and to carry on. Well, the central message as we follow along gives us one reason that we can dispel all of these myths with this one central message, and that is this: the Old Testament is invaluable. If we abandon the books of the Old Testament, we abandon a significant part, of the revelation of God, and we hinder our ability to understand the New Testament. One of the things you might want to write in your notes, I didn't put a blank here, is that the New Testament quotes at least 1,600 verses directly from the Old Testament. And so the Old Testament must be valuable because the New Testament refers to it so many times. And if we don't get what the Old Testament teaches, we miss Jesus. We miss what Jesus is it's preparing the way for us. And the more I read the Old Testament, the more I see that God is preparing the mindset, the heart, the understanding of what he was doing in sending his perfect Son into the world for us in the Gospels and the New Testament story. So the Lord of the universe gave us a whole book, and he gave us this whole book, Old and New Testament, for a reason. I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions that can come up in this study that you may have. I can't answer all the questions that I come up with, but hopefully we will help have a better overall picture of what God is doing and why the Old Testament is important. So now let's look at some different ways of how should we study the Old Testament. And we're going to look at three dimensions of the Old Testament, three approaches or perspectives that you can look at it. There is the literary dimension. The Old Testament is a book. It is a book of literature. I told not too many weeks ago in a sermon on a Sunday about my English teacher in high school named Mildred Dupree, a great educator. And she recognized the Bible was literature. And among the literature she exposed us to in high school English class was the book of Job and the book of Esther, because they were recognized as pieces of literature. And we saw literature from other cultures and other religions too, and other faith-based, but it was significant to me that in a literature class, we were studying the Bible appropriately so. And so we find all kinds of literature in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. There is a historical dimension. The Old Testament is real stories about real people in real places, and it provides us a background. We will see better about what's going on in history during these stories taking place, and that helps us understand why they play out some of the ways they do, and how all the Old Testament ties together when we get a grander perspective of the overall world history in those ancient days. And then there is a theological dimension, because it's not just telling us about people in real places in real times, but it's telling us about God, who exists eternally in eternal places. And we'll find, and we study and we see the revelation and the heartbeat characteristics, and a better understanding of who God is. And so the following is going to be an overview of how we approach the Old Testament. So let's move on down to the next section and answer the question, what is the Old Testament? And one of the first answers I give to you is the Old Testament is literature. It's a collection of 39 books. 39 of the 66 books in the Bible are in the Old Testament, and 27, of course, are in the New Testament. These books are traditionally classified by different genres or different types of literature included in, you can see in your outline, law, history, prophecy, poetry. Mixed in there, you get things like those genealogies, those lists of generations. You can have stories that are in there. You have songs that are in there. There are some apocalyptic visions, very symbolic, that we find mixed in these Old Testament books too. But these are the primary genres, types of literature that we have. So we have the Bible as a collection of 39 books, next written by a variety of authors. The Old Testament, don't forget, has one divine author, and that is the Holy Spirit. The Bible is inspired by God. But in the Holy Spirit's amazing work, he uses these human agents to write down his instructions to us. We find that the different writers that the Holy Spirit used have their own personalities, they have their own writing styles, and that gets incorporated into them also. And so we find through word choices and long sentences and short sentences, and we find different ways that still, even though they keep their individuality, but the Holy Spirit is behind it all, written by these various authors. You'll also note a point there that the Old Testament is primarily written in Hebrew, though there are a few parts in Old Aramaic. Hebrew is an interesting language. Hebrew, like some of our Oriental languages, is written from right to left, and it has 22 letters, all of which are consonants. There are no vowels in the Hebrew alphabet, and they put little accent marks over different letters and between different letters to help fill in the vowel sound that goes with the different consonants. When I was in seminary, I had to take advanced either Hebrew or Greek, and I chose to take Greek because Hebrew was such a hard language. I took a semester of Hebrew that I was required to take. And I tip my hat to all those folks who are scholarly and learned enough to read Hebrew and to speak Hebrew, be fluent in Hebrew, because it is a difficult language to grasp and to read and to translate. And that's what the Old Testament that we have is in. It was written over a span of about 1,000 years, maybe a little bit more. If you go back, and the next blank talks about the earliest parts written about 1,500 years ago, we will see there is a traditional understanding that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And so Moses lived about 1,500 years ago. So during his lifetime, those books established the end of the Old Testament time with Malachi and Ezra and Nehemiah, about 400 years BC. So 1,000 years, 1,100 years are divided there between them. And so 1,500 years ago, 400 BC would be about, you can fill in your blank, about the latest time that they would come. How do we get these books? How do these 39 books make it and recognize? They weren't the only things, of course, that were written down in ancient days. Well, the Old Testament was collected into a canon by God's people. A canon is a word for a collection of sacred writings that are recognized for exceptional inspiration that came from God. And a little bit of history there that you see on the top of your next page. In AD 90, at the Council of Jamnia, Jewish rabbis fixed the Jewish canon to these 39 books. I put 66 there, but the number really is 39 books, these 39 Old Testament books. You'll note that this is in the New Testament time. This is after Jesus. Some of the apostles and disciples are still alive doing ministry in AD 90. It's late in that time, but still going on. But these were books that had widely, long before then, been recognized as significant and different and exceptional They were respected and cherished, and so these is kind of given their affirmation, the stamp of approval to these 39 books to be special. And to this day, both in Christianity and in Judaism, the 39 books are considered that complete list of canonized sacred books. So we have that it was collected in a canon, next transmitted by the scribes. If you could find maybe in a museum the oldest copies that we have of the Bible, we have literally copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of many, many more copies of the original. There's never been found an original copy of any of the Gospels, like written by John or Matthew or Mark, or any of the Old Testament, nothing written by in the hand of Moses or Daniel or anyone else there, Ezekiel or Ezra. We have none of their writings. We just have copies of copies of copies of copies. And they have been copied by scribes. But when you study this, you are impressed with the detail to which the scribes go to make sure they copy accurately. And there were systems they had to meet, like they would know what the middle letter was in a certain book that they were copying. And so they would count. And if they got to that middle number and the middle letter was wrong, they knew they had made a mistake and they had to make a correction. And they would do things such as that. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found a little less than 100 years ago, and so suddenly we have much older copies of the Old Testament writings, many Old Testament writings we'd ever had before. We found that even these older copies were pretty close to what the copies we had, which is a tribute to the scribes, because through generations and generations, centuries and centuries, the scribes were very meticulous in copying them exactly. And finally, they are translated through servants even unto this day, that folks translate the Bible, and so putting the Hebrew into different languages that can be shared. I'll mention one in particular here because of its very historical significance, the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. Septuagint is the Greek word for 70, the number 70, because there were 70 scholars that worked on this translation. And it took place in the 2nd century BC, between the time of the Old Testament and the time of Jesus and the New Testament. So significant was this that when Alexander the Great and the Greek culture kind of goes through that area of the world, and even in Jesus' day, Greek was the common written language. The New Testament is written in Greek. When the New Testament then quotes the Old Testament, it tends to quote from the Septuagint, from the Greek copy of translation of the Old Testament. And so that is why it is very significant in history. It is oftentimes represented by the abbreviation 70 because of that representation of 70 scholars. Remind you today, even though there are many, many translations of the Bible, there are still those languages in the world. I understand as many as 1,000 languages that may not have the Old Testament, that only have the New Testament in their language, and as many as 2,500 languages in which the Bible has yet to be translated. Not a lot of big-sized people groups, of course, but our heart is, that where the Bible goes, the gospel goes. It introduces folks to that. So you have a brief overview of the literature of the Old Testament. Shows us how we got from these writings into the book that we have and we share together. The next question is, when and where did the events of the Old Testament take place? And now we looked at literature. Now we're going to look at the Old Testament as history. There is a historical dimension to things. Again, I want to mention this, and you can write it in, that the Old Testament is a real story set in real history. That there really were these people, and there really are these places, and these events really did take place. Sometimes they can be described in secular society as myths or legends, kind of made up stories that have gotten some traction and some people think are historical, but we believe they really did happen. A number of years ago, there was a movie about Moses and the Exodus out. It's called Gods and Kings. And it was okay. It took a lot of liberties that were outside of what was in the Bible and left things out and put things in. But I read where the director of the movie didn't even believe Moses existed, that it was just a myth. And so he took a lot of those liberties. No wonder he took those liberties. You don't think you're trying to be true to history in storytelling. But we believe the Bible is true to history and gives us some ideas about how the story was unfolded, especially as God was working in individual lives and in individual people. So I'm going to do here is take the Old Testament history made simple over roughly 1,000 years or so, maybe a little more, and give you 21 checkpoints as we'll walk through the Old Testament. And you have a lot of bullet points there on your outline to kind of fill in as we talk about them. You start at the beginning. So in the beginning, there was nothing and then something. When you or I create something, we say we're creative or crafty, we're going to make something. We start with some raw material, and then we take that and shape it and form it into something, whether that's ingredients for cooking or it's pieces of wood for some carpentry or something, or metal and a car comes out at the end of the assembly line. We start with some raw materials, create something. The story of creation is God starts with nothing. And from nothing, he creates something. And he creates the universe in Genesis chapter 1. By the end of Genesis chapter 2, we have creation, life, creatures, and humans made in God's image. And really, the essence of the material of our universe is complete by then. In chapter 3, the Garden of Eden quickly becomes the location of the fall of man. It said in chapter 1 of the Bible, we meet God. In chapter 2 of the Bible, we meet humanity. In chapter 3 of the Bible, we meet the devil. And the devil deceives man and woman. Sin comes, the world becomes fallen, humanity is corrupt, the world is corrupt and cursed, and hardships and disease and all kinds of terrible things because we are fallen people in a fallen world. And as the stories continue on, yet even then God shows mercy to Adam and Eve and clothes them, doesn't kill them, he provides for them. Even in the events that happen in the next chapters, humankind degenerates for many generations. Cain kills Abel, and then in those early chapters of the Bible, many, many more things happen until we come to the story of Noah and the flood, and that God judges the world with a flood. He spares one righteous man, Noah, and his family. And this idea of a fresh start, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have a lot of traction. It doesn't last very long, so humankind rebels at the Tower of Babel and results in divisions because they speak different language, and dispersion. They go their own way and form people groups that come, cultures and nationalities and countries as they form together in that way. Genesis chapter 12, we have a new beginning in God's faithfulness to Abraham and to his family. And now through Abraham and his descendants, ultimately the Hebrew people, God is going to reveal himself. God is going to seek to be an influence, a change maker into the world. This is also the point in the Bible where it's kind of easier for us to follow in modern history, because Abraham lived about 2,000 years BC. So roughly 4,000 years ago, we can put a stake in the ground and say, here is the timeline of Abraham. Abraham's story unfolds largely there from Genesis 12 through the end of Genesis, with Abraham's story and his family's Isaac, Isaac's children, Esau, and mostly following Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. One is named Joseph. He gets sold and ends up as a slave in Egypt. Eventually, after time in prison, he rises to become the second in power, and he invites his whole family, all of his brothers, all their families, his aged father Jacob at that time, to come and join him there. And we finish the book of Genesis with Abraham's descendants all living in Egypt. And by the time we get then into the book of Exodus, we find that they are slaves. Abraham's prosperity turns into Israel's slavery. And Pharaoh, the Egyptian people, have enslaved them for the hard labor that they carry out. They cry out to God for deliverance, literally for hundreds of years. And then we find the next point is the Exodus. Moses leading Israel out of Egypt. And what a significant story that is in those early chapters, starting with the call of Moses in Exodus 3 and on through as the 10 plagues come, as Pharaoh lets the people go, and then he changes his mind and pursues them, and the Red Sea parts, and the Hebrew people escape, and the armies of Pharaoh are destroyed. Just a significant piece of ancient Hebrew history of story in the Bible. Now, as they wander then in the security, safe from the escape from the Egyptians, we find next God gives the law. They go to Mount Sinai. God gives them law. In particularly, there is the 10 Commandments that are granted to them over a time. In this wandering times, they don't fulfill the faith to go into the promised land, so they wander for 40 years until you come to a place where the people enter the promised land, where they are ruled for a while by judges. Moses has died. Joshua takes leadership. Joshua is the first judge. Then we have the book of Judges and all the judges that are talked about in those stories. And then we get into the book of 1 Samuel, and we meet Samuel, who is in essence the last judge. He is just kind of the last person before they start having a monarchy and they name a king, which is the next point there. Eventually, a kingdom is established, epitomized by King David and his son Solomon. One of those times God says, you can have it your way. And the people ask for a king, and he gives them a king. Gives them Saul first. Doesn't go too well. But next comes David. And David leads the people to significant military strength. And then he hands things off to Solomon, who leads in economic strength. And he builds the temple, which becomes the center place of their worship. And our next point, Solomon builds the temple, becomes the home of the Ark of the Covenant, of the center of the people's worship. And there with David, with his military might, Solomon with the economic might, really is the zenith of Old Testament history for the Hebrew people. Because then, after Solomon dies, the kingdom divides into Israel in the northern kingdom and Judah into the southern kingdom, never to be joined together again. Back in June of this year, I preached a sermon on that story. It's not often preached, but I was sharing great stories of the Bible, and it was great because it made great significance that God's people were never united again. They couldn't agree, and they went their own ways, and it's a very sad and tragic tale to share in. But that's what happened, and so they exist as two kingdoms next to each other. And you see next, idolatry grows. Occasionally there's hints of revival. There are some good godly kings that rise up and stir things, but nothing really sticks for a long time. This is also a time when we find the prophets that are speaking to kings and the Old Testament prophets, some of them to the kings of Israel, some of them to the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah that are shared. We'll look at that when we look at individual prophets. Eventually, the power of Assyria destroys Israel in 722. 10 tribes of Israel are captive. They are taken away. It's believed that they disappear in history, that they just kind of blend into the culture around them. And the nation of Judah to the south survives for a bit longer until the Babylonian Empire comes strong, and Babylon destroys Judah in a period of time, a number of attacks, 597 BC until the ultimate fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC, 586 BC. And it is then that the elite of the Hebrew people, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Ezekiel, are taken to Babylon to live in captivity there. And really the focus of Old Testament story moves over to the Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon, where the Hebrew people are existing for a long time, for the next 70 years. Survivors taken to Babylon for 70 years. Eventually, a remnant returns to Jerusalem and rebuilds the temple. And we see those in the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, exciting stories, some of the Old Testament prophets that take place in that time trying to restore. God's given them a second chance. They are much more repentant. Their devotion is much more true to the Lord in this time. But it finishes with, and Israel still longs for the glory that it knew under David. Surely this is what God wants for us, but they're longing for that, looking for a new king who would come along. Of course, we know the new king is Jesus, who's going to be a different kind of king than David. But that's what they were looking for. And so the Old Testament has become a story without an ending. There is hope, there is promise, there is anticipation of one who would come in the name of the Lord. There is one who would come as the forerunner before that we'll find in the early stories in the gospel and John the Baptist. But those are 21 points that kind of outline a lot of the Old Testament for you. You will see in your material in the back pages, I believe this is on page 6, a map. And I put this map, if you can start down here in the bottom right-hand corner with Ur of the Chaldees. That's Genesis chapter 12. And that's where we find Abraham. And then Abraham goes to Haran, and God reveals himself there. And then Abraham comes down to Canaan and into Egypt, and then comes back to Canaan. And eventually they're back in Egypt again with Joseph and his family and all of Jacob's sons and their families. And they stay there hundreds of years, 300-400 years, till Moses comes, leads them out of slavery, across the Red Sea here and down, wandering in the wilderness until they cross over the promised land there, right above the Dead Sea at Jericho, where Joshua fought the battle. The walls came tumbling down. And for the greater part of history beyond, this is where the Hebrew people lived, roughly for 1,000 years, until the Assyrians came through. Assyria's up here in the top right, and destroys, takes 10 tribes away. They disappear. Babylon, then over here toward the middle of the page, comes, destroys Jerusalem, takes the people into captivity, and after 70 years, some come back, and that's where Old Testament history ends. So it gives you a little bit of a visual to kind of see where the movement of the story of the Old Testament takes place. An overview of the books of the Old Testament is where we're going to be going to from here. So I want to give you again kind of a grand scheme before we start looking at, starting in our next study, some of the individual books. Would you note with me that there are 3 main divisions of the Old Testament? The first is the story about God's people. Primarily, not exclusively, but primarily storytelling from Genesis through Esther, the first 17 books, primarily in chronological order. You will find in places like 1st and 2nd Chronicles a repeat of some of the stories you read in 1st and 2nd Kings. So it's not exactly in chronological order, but it's roughly there, primarily telling this grand story of God as creator and the fall of humanity, and God as redemptive and working with humanity, and finally working with Abraham, and then all the stories that carry out from his descendants. Then we have the next 5 books, and we call them the writings of God's people: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Psalms is primarily the poetry there. Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon, thought to be the wisdom literature. I took an Old Testament class in college on the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. We studied Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Solomon. It is a bit described as humans' response to God's revelation. And so in seeing here is how God's work, here are the choices that we make. It is a lot of somewhat observation, and we would say a good deal of some common sense, though always behind the trust in the Lord in the sense that comes from this. I taught last year 26 lessons on Proverbs and different topics, and just wise choices that are tools of education to young people of how to make good choices. And from maybe not the direct revelation, thus saith the Lord, but this is how life seems to be working. And helpful, healthy, responsible, obedient responses to the Lord that we find described there in the writings of God's people. The last books of the Bible, the final 17 books of the Bible, are the prophets from among God's people, starting with Isaiah all the way through Malachi. There are major prophets, there are minor prophets. It largely determines by how large the writing is. Is it a long book? Is it a short book? If it's a short book, they call it a minor prophet. If it's a long book, it's a major prophet. But I find that some of the minor prophets have some pretty major themes that we learn from them, and some of my favorites are from the minor prophets that are in there. It roughly fits into the time of the monarchy, the kings, that God put, okay, we're going to have a political leader in a king. I'm going to put beside him, I'm going to rise up these generations of spiritual leaders, these prophets that will be the voice of God in their ear. And while they're trying to run government in the way that they think it needs to be run, I'm going to be telling them to remember of their responsibility to the Lord. And sometimes they were sensitive to that and obedient to that, and a lot of times they had an adversarial relationship with the prophets. So, but that is a way the prophets kind of parallel the monarchy time and into then the exile time. We have some of the prophets like Daniel and Ezekiel that are in that time, and then after the exile, when they come back, there are a few in the final years in Nehemiah and Ezra, and in that season of time. Then there is a bit of a methodology that I want to talk about to our study as we wrap up today. First, we are going to, as we start next time, we are going to have an overview of each book. The story, the writings, the prophets. We'll talk about which one they belong to, which in time they belong to. We're going to do an overview of the section there, an overview of each book, and in each book there will be 2 points of discussion. There's a primary information for starters, just a general statement. This is what this book is about, a summary statement that we'll give, and then some of the practical advice for our study. This is what, even today, that we can gain and we can get out of this. And so we're going to follow a really similar format through 39 books of the Old Testament over the next 3 weeks, and see them in this information for starters, practical advice for the study, while remembering that they all fall within different categories there in the Old Testament, in the story, in the writings, and in the prophets. It's been good to share this time with you. I'm even more excited about where we're going, and stay tuned, and we will have going through the Old Testament books starting in our next lesson. Have a good day.